Hey guys! Tonight we're going to take a little trip back in time, and not to a glamorous royal court with gilded thrones and endless banquets, but to somewhere much less comfortable. Somewhere cold, damp, and deeply unappealing. Yes, we're settling into the world of medieval dungeons. Now, don't worry, I'm not here to scare you with gruesome horror details. This is still bedtime history. Think of this more as a very long guided tour through some of the most depressing basements in human history. You can keep your blanket tucked up around you, sip your tea, and be quietly thankful that your bed doesn't have rats running across it. Unless it does. And if that's the case, well, a medieval authenticity achieved. So, why wouldn't you last a day in one of these dungeons? Let's start by setting the scene. Medieval castles are often romanticized in movies: shining stone towers, fluttering banners, handsome knights on horseback. What we usually forget is that underneath those grand halls were cellars, storage rooms, and, if you were unlucky enough to annoy the wrong noble, dungeons. These were not the evil mastermind lairs that modern imagination tends to cook up. They were more like multi-purpose holding pens. And not even good ones. The word dungeon itself actually comes from the French donjon, meaning the keep or main tower of a castle. Over time, the meaning shifted. People began associating the gloomy basement rooms of that tower with imprisonment. So if you picture a massive Gothic tower looming over a misty countryside, at the bottom of it was usually a dark, airless chamber. That's where you'd be. Welcome home. And here's the first problem with you lasting even a day in there: oxygen. Ventilation was not exactly a medieval design priority. Many dungeons were literally just windowless stone chambers. The only fresh air you might get would be whatever seeped in through a small slit in the wall. Which means your first day inside, you'd probably feel lightheaded before the rats even showed up. Speaking of which, let's get acquainted with your new roommates. Rats, lice, and fleas were absolutely part of the experience. Cleanliness was not exactly the strong suit of medieval penal systems. Straw was sometimes laid down for prisoners to sleep on, but let's just say it wasn't changed regularly. Imagine an old gym mat that hasn't been cleaned in a decade, except it's alive with insects. That was your mattress. Now, technically, dungeons weren't always permanent long-term holding cells. Many were used more like waiting rooms. You'd be tossed in there until the lord or king figured out what to do with you: execution, ransom, or release. But because decision-making could drag on, sometimes prisoners languished for months, even years. And when I say languished, I really mean slowly wasted away in a damp, moldy stone closet. Let's drift over to the diet situation. Spoiler, not Michelin star. If you were lucky, your captors would feed you once a day. Bread and water were the cliché, but honestly, that was the high-end version. Some dungeons gave prisoners scraps of whatever the castle kitchen was throwing out. Picture moldy crusts, boiled gruel, maybe some meat too questionable for even the dogs. Hydration? A wooden bucket of water, if it hadn't already gone stale and green. Which brings us neatly to sanitation. Because of course, in a stone room with no plumbing, things had to go somewhere. Some dungeons had small drainage holes in the floor. Others didn't bother. Buckets were the usual solution. And as you might guess, buckets were not reliably emptied. So the entire chamber would quickly become a communal bathroom. Congratulations, you've just checked into the worst Airbnb in history. But here's a fun medieval twist: sometimes prisoners weren't even locked up underground. In some castles, the dungeon was actually an upper-level cell with a trapdoor. The prisoner was lowered down and basically abandoned in a pit. This was called an oubliette, from the French word oublier, to forget. And that was exactly the point. You were meant to be forgotten. Imagine sitting there in a vertical stone shaft, no windows, no door, just a hole above you. Your food and water, if they remembered you, would be dropped in. If they didn't, well, let's just say the oubliette was not a place that needed a very thorough cleaning crew. But again, this wasn't always about punishment. Medieval imprisonment was more of a political tool. Kings and lords didn't necessarily care about rehabilitation or justice. Dungeons existed to keep inconvenient people out of the way. Rival claimants to the throne, rebellious nobles, wealthy hostages waiting for ransom, these were the kinds of guests most likely to be thrown into a castle dungeon. And honestly, some of them got treated surprisingly well. If you were important enough, your dungeon might actually be a private chamber with decent food, a feather bed, and even servants. Basically, house arrest with more chains. The average peasant, though? They got the straw pile and the rats. Let's not forget torture. I know, not the most soothing bedtime subject, but we're going to treat it lightly here. Torture wasn't an everyday feature of dungeons, but it certainly happened. Devices like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or thumbscrews are often associated with medieval prisons. Some of those are actually later inventions or exaggerations. But yes, interrogation by physical discomfort was definitely a thing. The good news? Most people weren't tortured daily. The bad news? If you were, it was rarely a short appointment. Still, let's drift back to the quieter discomforts. Temperature, for example. Dungeons were cold in the winter, damp in the summer, and drafty all year round. You'd never really be warm or dry. Your clothes would mildew. Your hair would mat. Your skin would peel. And that smell? Imagine centuries of prisoners cycling through, all leaving their contribution behind. There's no medieval Febreze strong enough for that. Now, you might think you're tough. You might say, I could last a day, maybe two. But keep in mind that medieval people themselves didn't want to be there. Prison wasn't considered a noble ordeal. Even the roughest knights dreaded it. Chroniclers sometimes noted that being imprisoned underground was worse than being executed outright. At least execution was quick. A dungeon was just an endless, slow erosion of body and mind. There's also the boredom. No phones, no books, no podcasts, no chatty cellmates unless you were crammed in with others. Just you, your thoughts, and the sound of dripping water. Hours stretched into days, days into weeks. You'd probably start talking to the rats. Honestly, the rats would probably be more reliable conversationalists than your jailers. Of course, not all dungeons were equal. Some castles didn't even bother with special prisons, they just used ordinary rooms with locked doors. The Tower of London, for instance, became famous for its prisoners, but much of the time, high-profile captives were kept in decent chambers. The terrible the dungeon reputation really comes from the worst-case scenarios, like those oubliettes or underground pits. And even so, the psychological effect was the same: isolation, deprivation, and a very strong sense that life had gone downhill fast. So, why wouldn't you last a day? Because the combination of foul air, no hygiene, bad food, endless boredom, and rats nibbling at your toes would break you faster than you think. Even medieval nobles, raised in drafty castles, found it unbearable. You, with your memory foam mattress and temperature-controlled living room, wouldn't stand a chance. Let's float over now to some specific dungeons with particularly nasty reputations, because nothing says bedtime relaxation like a quick survey of stone basements. Alright, let's settle back into the quiet gloom of medieval stone. We've established that dungeons were generally damp, rat-infested, and soul-sapping. But what about actual historical examples? You know, real places where real people regretted every life decision that landed them in a cold cell. Let's wander over there. First up, we have the Tower of London. Of course you've heard of it. Everyone has. And for good reason. It was less of a single tower and more of a complex of towers, walls, and courtyards, a stone labyrinth built to keep people in, and occasionally, to let them out in a permanently unpleasant way. The tower is famous for housing prisoners of varying importance, queens, princes, traitorous nobles, and the occasional foreign diplomat who didn't know the local customs. Take Anne Boleyn, for instance. She was once Queen of England, stylish, ambitious, and slightly unlucky. Her time in the tower wasn't quite the royal spa experience you might imagine. While her cell wasn't exactly an oubliette, it was still a prison. Small, drafty, and with little privacy. Imagine sitting there in your finest gowns, pacing the floor, knowing the king had moved on and your fate was entirely in the hands of bureaucrats who enjoyed paperwork more than people. Her cell had some furniture, bed, chair, small table, but that only made the damp smell more noticeable. Not exactly candlelit charm, more like bedtime in a moldy storage unit. Anne wasn't alone in suffering through tower imprisonment. Her daughter, Elizabeth, yes, the future Elizabeth I, also spent time in a cold cell, though for different reasons. Political intrigue, accusations of treason, jealous courtiers, you name it. Elizabeth's experience shows that even those destined for greatness started out in environments that would crush the modern soul in less than a day. A spoiled royal childhood did not inoculate you against damp stone walls. Moving over to France, let's talk about the Bastille. Yes, the infamous fortress prison in Paris, made famous by revolutionaries and dramatized in novels. In reality, the Bastille wasn't a torture chamber by default, though it certainly became a symbol of oppression. Its cells were stone boxes with minimal light, poor ventilation, and the occasional visitor to check if you were still alive. Many prisoners were kept there simply because the king didn't know what else to do with them. Some were wealthy or high-ranking individuals who annoyed the bureaucracy, and let me tell you, wealth didn't mean comfort. You could be rich, royal, and still left with one measly window slit and a straw mattress that smelled like last year's rain. Of course, there's also the Château de Vincennes, another French fortress with a long prison tradition. The dungeons there were deep, cold, and designed to be discouraging. One particularly memorable prisoner was Nicolas Fouquet, finance minister to Louis XIV. Fouquet was accused of embezzlement and promptly sent to the dungeon. The irony is delicious. A man who had thrown extravagant parties, built lavish estates, and generally lived the high life ended up in a cell so dull it could inspire existential dread in the most optimistic philosopher. The lesson here: medieval dungeons were great equalizers. You could be a finance minister, a queen, or a rebellious peasant. In a dungeon, everyone smells roughly the same. Let's drift over to Germany, where we find the Hohenzollern castles. Their dungeons weren't famous worldwide, but within the local context, they were notorious. Small cells, thick stone walls, water seeping in through cracks, you know the drill. One of the more famous prisoners was a duke who had offended his cousins. Medieval family drama was often lethal, and imprisonment was the chosen method of keeping grudges alive without immediate execution. The duke spent months pacing his tiny cell, pondering what went wrong with family dinners, and probably wondering if he would ever see a carpet again. Spoiler, he didn't. Ireland had its fair share too. Dublin Castle had a particularly damp dungeon complex. Prisoners often remarked on the smell, which was a mix of mold, unwashed bodies, and whatever the rats decided to leave behind. One unfortunate rebel spent an entire winter there, surviving mostly on soggy bread thrown through a small window. Stories like these are common. Dungeons were as much about boredom and discomfort as they were about punishment. The psychology of confinement was the real torment, long before anyone invented sensory deprivation tanks for the modern elite. Let's pause here to consider the social hierarchy in prisons. You might think medieval incarceration was egalitarian in its misery. After all, walls are walls, rats are rats. But no. Status still mattered. Highborn prisoners could expect slightly better quarters. Maybe a small mattress, a chair, and a bit more food. Lower-class captives? They got nothing beyond the bare floor and occasional scraps. That's why some historical accounts read almost like Yelp reviews for the afterlife would not recommend for extended stays. Staff rude, amenities lacking, water tastes funny. And if you're imagining this as a strictly European problem, think again. Ottoman dungeons, for instance, were just as grim. Prisoners were often kept in subterranean cells, chained to walls, with no ventilation. If you were important, you might get a mat and some food. If not, you were basically a footnote in the Sultan's paperwork. A small comfort, Ottoman prisons often allowed some socialization, which meant prisoners could trade news and gossip. Of course, that only made the slow passage of time more noticeable. One day, a prisoner might think, "Feels like 5 years already." Back in England, the story of Guy Fawkes is worth noting. You know him, the guy with the plot, the gunpowder, and the eventual notoriety. Fawkes was caught, interrogated, and imprisoned in the Tower. His cell wasn't a lavish suite, but he was treated well enough to survive the initial questioning. Yet he still spent hours staring at cold stone, thinking about the plot and probably regretting that whole gunpowder scheme. That's a recurring theme with prisoners. No matter your plans or your status, the dungeon has a leveling effect. Time stretches, walls close in, and even the cleverest conspirators find themselves counting cracks in the stones. Now let's talk a little bit about the daily experience, because it's surprisingly repetitive. You wake up, or maybe you don't really wake up, mornings blend into afternoons, eat something that's probably edible, pace or sit, and occasionally interact with guards. Then you sleep. Repeat. Sleep deprivation wasn't always intentional, but in a poorly ventilated stone room, exhaustion was inevitable. The monotony of it all is exhausting even to think about, which is why you wouldn't last a day. Your modern brain thrives on stimulation, medieval cells offered precisely none. Let's float over to some more unusual cases. There's a castle in Scotland, Eilean Donan, yes, the one with the famous bridge and scenic views. Its dungeon was mostly waterlogged. Prisoners could often hear the lock outside and maybe even smell the heather, but there was no comfort to be had. One rebel spent weeks down there, hearing the wind whistle above, thinking wistfully about the life he had outside. If you tried to meditate in a modern yoga class for that long, you'd probably last half an hour before panic set in. He had months. Even lesser-known dungeons had their charms, for the builders, at least. Thick stone walls, clever drainage, and small windows that could be barred with iron. Architects were proud of their creations. They weren't thinking about prisoners' mental health. If anything, the unpleasant experience factor was a design feature. A dungeon needed to discourage escape, but also to psychologically wear people down. Rat-induced paranoia? Check. Damp chills? Check. Smell of moldy bread? Check. And what about entertainment? Trick question. There wasn't any. Some prisons allowed correspondence with the outside world, but mostly it was limited to official letters or ransom negotiations. Reading material? Rare. Chessboards? Only if you bribed a guard. In general, your brain had to make its own entertainment, which often involved imagining scenarios you would rather not imagine. A perfect storm for anxiety and mild existential dread, again, the medieval method of bedtime prep in extreme form. So far, we've painted a picture of dungeons as cold, damp, rat-infested chambers. But let's make it a little more personal. After all, the real appeal of medieval history, for our sleepy bedtime purposes, is the absurd, tragic, and occasionally ridiculous lives of those who actually had to endure it. Let's start with Charles I of England. You probably know him as the king who had a famous disagreement with Parliament, and then, well, things got messy. Before his eventual execution, Charles spent time effectively imprisoned. His cells were not underground oubliettes, but they were still constricting. Guards were polite but persistent, food was regular but uninspiring, and the whole experience had a way of making even the king feel small. Imagine pacing your room, trying to think like a king, but mostly just noticing the cracks in the ceiling. For a man accustomed to grand halls and stately banquets, it was a shockingly humbling environment. Charles was, of course, a complicated character. He had a flair for drama, enjoyed fine clothing, and believed in divine right like it was a tax-exempt philosophy. But locked in a room with nothing but a narrow bed and a bucket, even divine right felt insufficient. He reportedly spent hours writing letters and composing thoughts, trying to maintain dignity in confinement. Which is a polite way of saying he was bored, uncomfortable, and increasingly aware that power had limits, at least when there are stone walls involved. Let's float over to France again, to the case of the unfortunate Queen Marie Antoinette. Though her ultimate imprisonment came later in the French Revolution, she provides a fascinating window into how elite prisoners endured. Her cell at the conciergerie was cold, damp, and sparsely furnished. No gilded furniture, no silk drapes. Just a small bed, a wooden chair, and the ever-present chill. She reportedly spent a lot of time knitting and writing letters, mostly to herself or sympathetic friends. This was not a spa retreat. It was a survival exercise in patience, monotony, and the quiet realization that life had taken a turn for the dramatically inconvenient. Of course, medieval dungeons were rarely this high class. Let's drift back to Germany for a story about Duke Albrecht, who offended his relatives during a family dispute. Medieval dynastic quarrels were brutal, but execution was sometimes too permanent, so imprisonment was preferred. Albrecht's dungeon experience was unremarkable in most senses: stone walls, damp floors, and very little food. But he had the misfortune of sharing his cell with another prisoner, a minor nobleman who liked to talk endlessly about the relative merits of regional wines. For weeks, Albrecht had to endure lectures on grape acidity while trying not to lose his mind. Even for a man who had spent decades in courts filled with pomp and ceremony, the monotony was insidious. Meanwhile, in England again, there's the famous story of Edward II. He was a king whose reign ended in typical medieval fashion, poorly. Captured by his enemies, he was imprisoned and faced conditions that were technically survivable but emotionally taxing. Accounts suggest he was kept in small, dark chambers with minimal furnishings, essentially living as a ghost of his former royal self. And the irony, which is perfect for bedtime history, is that a king who once lived in opulent palaces could be reduced to pacing a tiny room, counting the stones on the floor, and wondering where all the respect went. Even children were not immune. Medieval royal children, particularly those in contested succession lines, often ended up in confinement as well. The famous Princes in the Tower case comes to mind. Two young boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, were placed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection, according to historical documents. In reality, the situation was far less comfortable. They were confined to modest rooms, with limited company and constant surveillance. Even with servants to attend to them, the experience was isolating. And the psychological impact? Imagine being a child, accustomed to the expansive privileges of royal life, suddenly stripped of freedom and privacy, left to face the echo of your own footsteps. Not exactly a recipe for a restful night. Let's glide south to Italy, where the dungeons of various city-states held a strange mix of nobles, mercenaries, and political troublemakers. In Florence, for example, prisoners often found themselves in small, stone rooms with little more than straw mats. One notable case involved a minor duke who had opposed Medici policies. His captors were polite enough not to torture him immediately, but the conditions, drafty walls, poor lighting, and a diet of stale bread made life slowly unbearable. He reportedly spent hours observing the patterns of the stone walls, creating imaginary narratives about their origins, and pondering whether escape was even feasible. He did not escape. And then there's the less glamorous but equally interesting world of Castle Oubliettes, vertical pits designed to hold prisoners indefinitely. Some were entirely sealed, with only a tiny opening at the top for food and waste. Imagine being lowered into such a pit. It's dark. It's cold. The walls are slick with moisture. And the only human interaction is the occasional guard tossing scraps down. Many prisoners in Oubliettes lasted mere weeks before succumbing to neglect, illness, or despair. The lesson for us moderns is clear: psychological endurance was as critical as physical survival, and both were constantly tested. Now, some people might think that dungeons were always sinister. But occasionally, they were surprisingly mundane. In England, some lower-level nobles were confined in chambers that were more like modest apartments than terrifying pits. They had beds, chairs, tables, and even fireplaces. The catch? They were still prisoners. Walls are walls, after all, and being able to cook your own stew doesn't make the absence of freedom any less impactful. In fact, it can be worse: you have time to think. And think they did. Prisoners would often write journals, craft small objects from available materials, and sometimes negotiate ransoms. Mental stimulation, however small, could be both a lifeline and a subtle form of torture. Too much time to think, and you remember just how unfortunate your situation is. Let's float north to Scandinavia for a brief detour. Castles in Norway and Sweden had similar dungeon traditions: cold stone, damp floors, and minimal light. One notable case involved a minor royal who had fallen out of favor. His cell was simple but secure, and he reportedly spent hours staring at the frost forming on the window, wondering if anyone outside remembered he existed. Again, the lesson is clear: isolation in stone rooms, even without overt cruelty, is deeply uncomfortable. It's a psychological attrition machine. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, high-status prisoners sometimes found themselves in surprisingly well-furnished cells. Still, monotony prevailed. Even with a mat, blankets, and occasional visitors, prisoners often counted days as a form of entertainment. The wealthy might even be allowed to keep pets or books, but these were tiny distractions in the otherwise relentless boredom of confinement. In short, whether in Europe or the Middle East, the medieval prison experience was universally unpleasant. Now, before we drift toward sleep entirely, let's consider the broader takeaway. Dungeons were not just about punishment, they were about control, boredom, and quiet psychological pressure. Even nobles accustomed to privilege could be worn down by monotony, dampness, and the endless echo of their own thoughts. Even children, raised in gilded halls, could feel the oppressive weight of stone. And if you're a modern viewer in a cozy bed, sipping tea, it's worth noting, you would not last a day. Not because of torture or swords, but because the mind, when faced with confinement and relentless monotony, begins to unravel. And yet, there is a strange comfort in knowing the universe had a sort of consistency. Medieval dungeons didn't discriminate between king, queen, or minor noble. Everyone endured the same stone walls, the same chill, the same creeping awareness that freedom was far away. There's almost a poetic quality to it. A reminder that the past, as grim as it sometimes was, had its own rules and rhythms, rules we can safely observe from the comfort of our modern bedrooms. Now that we've wandered through various famous dungeons and met some notable prisoners, it's time to settle into the quieter, weirder aspects of dungeon life, particularly how royals, spoiled from birth, handled confinement. Spoiler: often poorly. Take King Charles VI of France, for instance. Known as Charles the Mad, because yes, he had episodes of sudden insanity, he was a monarch who could, at times, forget he was king. When confined to a cell, even briefly for political reasons, he reportedly spent hours wandering around, talking to imaginary courtiers. Now, this might sound tragic, and it was, but imagine being a 21st century prisoner in a padded cell with no Wi-Fi, and your only companions are shadows and echoes. That's roughly what Charles experienced, though with slightly more velvet involved. And then there's the Habsburg family, renowned for their inbreeding and dynastic quirks. Their dungeons were often filled not just with political prisoners but occasionally with estranged relatives. Some of these poor souls were so genetically interesting that they had minor deformities, fragile health, or peculiar habits. Imagine being in a cold stone cell with someone who insists on explaining the intricate details of your shared family tree for hours. Fascinating? Sure. Sleep-inducing? Absolutely, for everyone involved. Meanwhile, in England, Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort to Henry VI, spent time imprisoned during the Wars of the Roses. Her cells were less about punishment and more about containment. She reportedly spent her days quietly sewing, pacing, and reflecting on political disasters, a more productive routine than most modern prisoners, but still deeply isolating. Her story highlights a recurring dungeon theme: boredom is sometimes the cruelest form of punishment. Nothing breaks the mind quite like endless hours of quiet reflection in a stone room. Let's drift north again, to Scandinavia. Margaret I of Denmark, a queen who united several kingdoms, was rarely imprisoned herself, but her relatives and rivals often found themselves in austere dungeons. One minor prince, for example, was confined for nearly a year for minor political dissent. He reportedly amused himself by cataloguing the number of stones in the walls and predicting which would loosen first. It's an oddly precise hobby, but when your options are staring at walls or staring at walls, any form of mental engagement is welcome. Back in France, Louise of Savoy, a mother of Francis I, once dealt with family members who had to spend extended periods in confinement for political missteps. In their cells, they would attempt to maintain some semblance of aristocratic life: small meals, carefully arranged clothing, polite conversation with guards. The contrast between their luxurious upbringing and their austere surroundings was often painfully ironic. You could almost hear the mental sigh: I was born to sit on a throne, and here I am arranging a straw pile in a damp cellar. And then there's the curious case of the princes of the Tower. Edward V and his brother Richard are famous, but less often discussed are the small, subtle indignities of their confinement. Their cells were modestly furnished, but the psychological weight of being observed constantly, with servants coming and going, must have been oppressive. Even royal children are not immune to monotony-induced despair. Imagine the endless pacing, the quiet counting of days, the wondering if your existence is remembered outside stone walls. It's almost meditative, if your meditation involves mild panic and a growing appreciation for fresh air. Let's take a quick side trip to the Ottoman Empire again. High-ranking prisoners often had more comfortable cells, sometimes even personal attendants. Yet the monotony persisted. Some wrote letters, some practiced calligraphy, and some simply watched the shadows shift across the stone walls. One captured noble reportedly kept a small notebook detailing the patterns of sunlight on his floor, an odd but soothing pastime, especially when the world outside was chaotic and inaccessible. Even privilege doesn't immunize you against boredom, it merely allows for fancier methods of coping. Now, let's look at a more domestic aspect of dungeon life: hygiene. This is a quiet topic, but important. Many dungeons lacked running water. Baths were rare. Clothing was often damp and rarely cleaned. Guards sometimes brought fresh straw for bedding, but it was irregular. Royal or high-ranking prisoners might have had small servants to help with basic needs, but even they were limited. For most, the dungeon was a place where personal comfort was not just minimal, it was almost non-existent. You would spend your days worrying about warmth, dryness, and basic cleanliness instead of politics or leisure. Food, as we mentioned before, was another challenge. Bread, water, and occasionally a bit of meat or gruel were standard. But meals could be sporadic, dependent on the whims of the guards or the availability of scraps. High-ranking prisoners might enjoy better rations, cheese, wine, fruit, but even this was meager compared to the banquets they were used to. The irony is deliciously sad. A king accustomed to feasts could spend weeks staring at a stale loaf, wondering if the baker outside knew his plight. And of course, there were small absurdities. Rats, as ever, were the unofficial dungeon mascots. They gnawed at crumbs, ran along walls, and occasionally served as unintended alarm systems when a guard approached. Flies buzzed incessantly. The stone walls would drip with condensation, sometimes pooling into puddles. Noise was minimal, except for the occasional distant footsteps, dripping water, or rats skittering across a floor. Silence, it turns out, can be just as oppressive as noise, a fact our ancestors discovered over and over. Now, let's drift to interpersonal conflicts. Even in confinement, human nature persists. Some dungeons held multiple prisoners, and personalities clashed. One notable case involved two noble rivals sharing a cell in a German fortress. They spent weeks arguing over trivial matters: who would sit closer to the small window, whose turn it was to receive scraps first, and the proper alignment of their straw bedding. To a modern ear, this might sound humorous. To the prisoners, it was yet another layer of psychological attrition. You can't escape the petty politics, even when everyone is stuck in a cold stone box. Meanwhile, some prisoners amused themselves with small acts of rebellion. Secretly carving initials into the wall, exchanging whispered messages, or sneaking small items from guards. These acts were minor, but in a place designed to suppress agency, even tiny gestures of control mattered. It's a reminder that humans are remarkably adaptable, even if adaptation mostly involves minor mischief to stave off despair. And then, of course, there were attempts at exercise. Pacing was common. Some prisoners counted steps, tried simple stretches, or rehearsed speeches aloud. Edward II, for instance, reportedly spent hours pacing and talking to imaginary advisors. Again, the juxtaposition of grand ambitions and tiny cells is almost laughable, if it weren't so quietly tragic. The dungeon doesn't care about rank, reputation, or intelligence. It simply exists to contain, to confine, and to bore. Finally, let's consider the psychological trickery of time. Days blurred together. Nights were dark and often cold. Guards came at unpredictable intervals, bringing food or water or simply checking that you were still alive. Without calendars, clocks, or reliable cues, prisoners lost track of time. Hours stretched, days folded into one another, weeks became months in perception even if not in reality. The mind adapts in strange ways. You start noticing patterns in the dripping water, counting cracks in the wall, predicting the routine of guards. And that, perhaps, is the true genius of the medieval dungeon. It teaches patience through monotony, endurance through tedium, and resilience through quiet, persistent discomfort.